She had learned in 7 years of invisible service that the people who never look at you are the ones who never see what you are doing right in front of them. The rain came down in curtains that night, thick and gray and indifferent, the kind of rain that does not apologize for what it destroys. Nadia Vasquez stood at the servants' entrance of the Caruso estate with her uniform soaked through to her spine, her dark hair plastered flat against her cheeks, her hands shaking not from cold, but from the very controlled effort of not doing something she could not take back. The door was locked. She had heard the bolt slide home herself, a small, deliberate sound in the grand marble corridor, followed by the clip of Valentina Reyes's heels walking away. Deliberate. Considered. A message dressed up as an accident. The estate's rear entrance did not lock automatically. Someone had to turn the key. Inside, 140 guests sat at tables set with hand-folded gardenias and crystal that cost more per stem than Nadia made in a week. Somewhere in that warm, fragrant interior, the man she had worked beside for 7 years was hosting his engagement dinner, and the woman he intended to marry had just thrown his senior housekeeper into the rain with a bolted door and a smile Nadia had watched spread across Valentina's face like a slow oil spill. She stood in the dark and the wet and counted to 10 in her head, because 10 had always been enough. She had been counting to 10 for a very long time. Her name was Nadia Vasquez, and she was 31 years old, and she ran the Caruso estate the way a conductor runs an orchestra, which is to say that everything beautiful about the performance was her work, and none of the audience thought to look at who held the baton. She was 5'4" and built, as her grandmother used to say, like a woman meant to last, with wide hips and heavy breasts and a softness to her frame that the world of the Caruso household treated as a kind of apology, as though her body were a note written in the wrong language. The staff adored her. The suppliers feared missing a delivery. The florist in the village called her Miss Nadia, and always added an extra bloom without being asked, because Nadia paid on time and remembered his daughter's name. The guests at formal dinners walked past her as though she were part of the wallpaper, elegant. Wallpaper, perhaps, but background all the same. Domenico Caruso had not looked at her in 7 years. That is not quite true, and precision matters here. He had looked at her with the practiced appreciation of a man who notices that a mechanism functions. He said good morning. He said the dining room looks exceptional, Nadia, when it did. He said, in the measured tones of a man who managed silence the way other men managed armies, I do not know what we would do without you. And then he turned away and demonstrated exactly how little he had meant it by proceeding to do everything without her input the moment Valentina Reyes arrived in his life 4 months ago with her long legs and her art world connections and her talent for making every room feel as though she owned it. Domenico was 38, dark-haired and possessed of a stillness that frightened people who did not know him and unsettled people who did. He ran his family's business empire with an economy of gesture that invited no questions, and the questions people chose not to ask him in the light were the ones that explained why the Caruso name appeared on no government registry yet controlled half the import traffic through the eastern ports. He was not cruel. That was the thing that made it harder, not easier. He was not cruel. He was simply, profoundly, catastrophically blind. Nadia had spent 7 years watching him and had understood him in the way that only people who are never watched in return can understand someone. She knew he took his coffee without sugar because sweetness made him feel indebted to the morning. She knew he kept a photograph of his mother in the left inside pocket of every suit jacket he owned and had never once mentioned it. She knew that when he said fine in a particular flat tone, he meant the opposite and was giving someone a single, last opportunity to correct themselves before he acted. She knew the sound his footsteps made when he was carrying something he refused to put down. She also knew, because she was the person who vetted every supplier, every subcontractor, and every vendor connected to the estate, that the event company Valentina had insisted on using for the engagement dinner had been invoiced twice for the same flowers, the same staff, and the same equipment, and that the second invoice was addressed to a holding company registered in Valentina's maiden name. She had found it 3 days ago. She had said nothing yet. She was waiting, because Nadia understood timing the way she understood the grain of the estate's mahogany floors, which is to say, she understood it in her bones. She stood in the rain for 11 minutes. She counted. Then she walked around the perimeter of the estate, past the rose beds that she had personally replanted the previous spring, past the fountain she had argued with the stonemason about for 2 weeks until he admitted she had been right about the drainage angle. And she went to the garden shed where she kept a spare key for emergencies. Emergencies, it turned out, included being locked out of your own domain by a woman who had mistaken convenience for power. She changed into the dry uniform she kept folded in the shed's cabinet, because she kept a dry uniform in the shed's cabinet because she was Nadia Vasquez, and she accounted for contingencies. She redid her hair in 3 minutes. She pressed her lapels flat with her hands. Then she unlocked the kitchen entrance from the inside out, walked through the kitchen where the catering staff was plating the 4th course, corrected a sauce temperature without breaking stride, and stepped into the dining hall exactly as the sommelier was fumbling the pour on a $1,200 Barolo. She took the bottle from him with 2 fingers and poured it correctly and set it down and moved to the head steward's position at the edge of the room, and not one guest at those 140 seats noticed she had been gone. Valentina Reyes, seated at Domenico's right hand and a dress the color of old bone, noticed. Her eyes found Nadia across the room with the particular sharpness of a person who had expected a problem to solve itself and found the problem still standing. Something moved in Valentina's expression. Something careful. Domenico did not notice. Domenico was speaking to his second in command, a compact, watchful man named Sal Ferretti, who had worked beside Domenico for 15 years and who was the only other person in the room who had watched Nadia materialize from the periphery with something approaching recognition. Sal's eyes moved from Nadia to the door she had entered through, to the clock above the sideboard, and back to Nadia. He said nothing. He filed it. The dinner concluded without incident, which was the whole of Nadia's ambition for the evening. She oversaw the dessert service and the post-dinner cordials and the careful choreography of 140 guests putting on coats and finding cars and departing through the grand front entrance, while she ensured that not a single thing went wrong in any room simultaneously, which required her to be in approximately 4 places at once, which she managed the way she managed everything, by having already done most of it before it needed to happen. At 11:47, the last car left the drive. At 11:52, Domenico walked through the drawing room where Nadia was overseeing the initial clear, and he said, "The evening went perfectly," and he meant it as a compliment, and he kept walking. She looked at the space where he had been, and then she looked at the table, and she began counting the crystal. Valentina found her at midnight, which was not an accident. The woman moved through the estate with the proprietorial ease of someone who had already mentally redecorated every room, and she stopped in the doorway of the drawing room with her shoes in one hand and her expression arranged into something it took Nadia a full second to identify as concern. "I hope you weren't waiting too long in the rain," Valentina said. "The lock must have slipped." Nadia set down a wine glass with a small, clean click. She looked at Valentina Reyes for the first time all evening with her full attention, and what Valentina saw in that gaze must have been something she had not expected, because she shifted her weight back by 2 inches without appearing to notice she had done it. "These things happen," Nadia said. Her voice was level as still water, and she turned back to the crystal, and she did not say another word. Valentina left. The door closed behind her. Nadia stood alone in the room that she had dressed and undressed 1,000 times, and she permitted herself, for exactly 4 seconds, to feel all of it. The cold that had gone into her spine during those 11 minutes in the rain, the particular indignity of a locked door, the weight of 7 years spent being essential and invisible in equal measure. 4 seconds. Then she went back to the crystal. The morning came in gray and clean-washed, the grounds glittering with last night's rain, as though the estate had decided to apologize on behalf of its future mistress. Nadia was already at her desk in the estate's administrative office at 6:45, which was when she was always at her desk. The 3 invoices spread before her and her notes beside them in the precise, narrow handwriting that filled the ledgers she had kept for 7 years. She was going through them for the last time, not because she was uncertain, but because she was the kind of person who checked her certainty before she used it as a weapon. The numbers were clear. The Engagement Dinners event company had billed the estate $112,000 for services rendered. The same company had simultaneously billed a holding company called Aura Venue Consulting for an identical package of services, the same staff, the same florals, the same equipment, on the same date, for $87,000. Aura Venue Consulting had been registered 4 months ago in the state of Delaware with a single director, a woman whose legal name was Valentina Cruz de Reyes. The money did not go to any vendor. It went into an account Nadia had traced through the registration documents with the focused patience of someone who understood that the truth rarely hides. It simply waits for someone willing to look where it's inconvenient to look. Nadia had done this not because she hated Valentina Reyes. She had done it because it was her job, specifically her job, and the estate's financial oversight was her responsibility, and she had found something, and she could not unknow it. She had also, she was honest with herself about this, done it because she had watched Valentina spend 4 months redecorating a man she did not understand, and Nadia found the project offensive in some deep and wordless place that she did not allow herself to name. She was still sitting there when Sal Ferretti appeared in the doorway at 7:15, which told her he had been there longer than that and had been deciding something. Sal was 53, compact, and fond of expressing himself in very short sentences that carried unreasonable loads of meaning. He looked at the papers on her desk. He looked at her. He said, "How bad?" She turned the top invoice to face him. He read it. His face did not change, which was its own answer. He said, "Does he know?" "Not yet," she said. "How long?" he said. 3 days, she said. He absorbed this. He said, "You were being careful." She said, "I am always being careful." He nodded once, the way a man nods when he has just recalculated everything he thought he knew. He said, "He should hear it from you." She said, "I know." He left. She sat for another moment, her hands flat on the papers, and she let herself feel one small, specific thing, which was that she had no pleasure in this. It would have been easier to feel pleasure. Pleasure would have given her a clean story about herself. She felt nothing so tidy. She felt the weight of something she had held for 3 days, and the knowledge of what it would cost when she put it down. She asked Sal to arrange 15 minutes with Domenico at 8:30. Sal came back in 4 minutes and said the time was cleared, which meant Domenico had cleared it without being told what it was about, which was either routine or not, and she did not waste energy deciding which. Domenico's office occupied the northeast corner of the estate's main floor. all dark shelving and a desk that had been his father's and morning light coming in cold and direct through uncurtained windows because he did not believe in softening the morning. He was standing when she entered, not at the desk, but at the window with a coffee cup, and he turned when she came in with the look of a man who has allocated 15 minutes and is prepared to use them well. She set the invoices on the desk without preamble. She said, "I need you to look at these." He came to the desk, and he looked. He was the kind of man who read things once and understood them completely, and she watched the understanding move through him, which in Domenico's case was not an expressive event, but an interior one, visible only in the slight arrest of his breathing and the very controlled setting down of his coffee cup. He read for 90 seconds. He said, "When did you find this?" "3 days ago," she said. He said, "And you waited." "I wanted to be certain," she said. "I am certain." He looked at the third page. He looked at the registration document with Valentina's name. He set it down with 2 fingers and stepped back from the desk and stood very still in the morning light, and Nadia watched him do what Domenico Caruso did when the world required something of him he had not budgeted for, which was to draw himself to a stillness that most people in his life found frightening and that Nadia had always found simply human. The stillness of a man refusing to become something he would not recognize. He said, "You should have told me immediately," she said, with respect. "I needed 3 days to make it airtight. If I had told you with 1 invoice, you would have had a conversation. With all 3 in the registration, you have a fact." The silence after that was the particular kind that is not empty. He said, "Is there anything else you found that I should know?" She said, "Not in the accounts, but I watched the dinner last night." The event staff answered to a supervisor who answered to a contact on Valentina's phone and not to me, which is not the arrangement we agreed. 3 of them were in the East Corridor twice without cause. I don't know yet what they were looking for. He said, "But you have a thought." She said, "Your father kept correspondence in the study cabinet on the East Corridor. I moved it to the secondary archive room 8 weeks ago when I reconfigured the filing system. It was not an announcement. No one was told. Whatever they were looking for in that corridor was not there. The silence this time was different. He was looking at her with an expression she had not catalogued before in 7 years of watching this man, and she could not immediately name it, so she looked at the wall above his shoulder the way she did when she needed to hold herself at the correct distance from a thing. He said, "You moved the files 8 weeks ago," she said. "Routine archival management." He said, "Or you saw something coming 8 weeks ago." She said nothing because nothing was the accurate answers. She had seen nothing specifically. She had simply been Nadia Vasquez, who maintained things because things needed maintaining, and the effect was the same as foresight, which was perhaps why foresight and attentiveness were difficult to tell apart. He picked up his phone. He said, "Stay." She stayed. He made 2 calls. The first was to Sal. It was 14 words. The second was to the estate's legal counsel. It was 31 words. He hung up, and he looked at her, and he said, "The engagement dinner was last night." "Yes," she said. He said, "Which means there's a wedding in 6 days." "Yes," she said. He said, "And the caterer, the florist, the venue arrangements for the wedding, all contracted through my office," she said. "Through vetted vendors I selected, none through the event company." He was still looking at her. She had the vertiginous sensation of being looked at with more attention than she was accustomed to being given, and she held herself steady against it the way she had held herself steady against the rain, because the discipline of a lifetime does not take a morning off simply because someone is finally paying attention. He said, "Go have breakfast. I will need you at 10. She said, "Yes." She went to the kitchen and she ate a piece of toast, and she drank her coffee, and she looked out the window at the rain-washed rose beds she had planted, and she allowed herself, in the full privacy of her own chest, to feel the shift in the morning's weight. What happened between 8:45 and 10 took place in rooms Nadia was not in, and she learned the shape of it afterward from Sal, who told her in the economical style of a man who respects his listener's ability to fill in human detail. Domenico had spoken to Valentina. The conversation had been private and brief. A car had been called. 2 members of the estate's security staff had accompanied Valentina's luggage to a hotel in the city, a good hotel because Domenico was not theatrical in his cruelties, and the provision of a good hotel was the kind of gesture that closed a chapter without requiring a scene. Valentina had gone. The East Corridor staff were identified and dismissed. The financial irregularities were in the hands of the legal team by 9:15. The wedding was canceled at 9:47 in the morning, which was a Monday, 6 days before it was scheduled to occur, and the people who were asked to make the necessary notifications made them. And the machinery of dismantling an event worth $400,000 began its grinding work, and Nadia was not asked to manage any part of it because Sal managed that, because Domenico had told him, "Do not put this on Nadia." Nadia found that out later, too, and she sat with it for a while. At 10 o'clock, she was in Domenico's office again, and this time he was at the desk, and there was a second coffee waiting, which there had never been before, not in 7 years. And the fact of a second cup in a room where she had stood for 7 years without one sat in her sternum like a quiet, insistent pressure. She sat. She took the cup. She did not comment. He said, "I need to understand something." She waited. He said, "Last night." The door. She kept her expression level. She said, "The servant's entrance locked." He said, "Sal says the entrance does not lock automatically." She said, "No." He said, "How long were you outside?" She said, 11 minutes. He said, "In the rain?" She said, "Yes." He said, "And then you came back in and ran the rest of the dinner." She said, "That was my job." He set down his pen. He said, "Nadia." He said it the way a person says a word they have been using as a label and have just understood as a name. She looked at him then, straight and direct, because she was done, she decided, with looking at the wall above his shoulder. She was 31 years old, and she had been standing in the periphery for 7 of them, and she had last night stood in the rain and then come back inside and done her work, and she was done with the economy of her own gaze. He said, "Why did you stay?" 7 years. And I never. He stopped. She said, "Because the estate needed running." He said, "That is not an answer." She said, "It is the only part of the answer that was your business." He was quiet. Then he said, "And the rest?" She said, "The rest is mine." He looked at her for a long time. Outside, the morning had clarified into something cold and bright, the rose beds visible through the window and the particular, vivid, wet red of roses after rain, everything sharper for what had fallen the night before. He said, "I owe you an accounting," she said. "You owe me nothing I am waiting to collect." He said, "I am offering one without being asked." She said, "Then I am listening." He said, "I have been running this estate, this family, this entire operation for 15 years, and in that time, the only thing that has functioned perfectly, without crisis, without loss, without a single failure I could trace to its management, has been everything in your hands. I knew that. I knew it in the way you know the load-bearing wall is there because the house is standing. You don't look at it, you just live in the house." He stopped again. He said, "I was living in the house and I never looked at the wall." She said nothing. He said, "That will not continue." She said, "I am not sure what you mean by that." He said, "I mean that I intend to see you, all of it, everything I walked past." He said it plainly, without decoration, in the flat voice of a man making a declaration he intends to be held to. And then, because he was Domenico Caruso and not a man who performed his vulnerability for an audience, he picked up his pen and said, "The vendor contracts for the reconfigured event schedule will need a review. I would like you to lead it." She said, "I already started the file." He said, "Of course you did." and something moved in his expression, something not quite a smile, too rueful and too struck for a smile, the look of a man receiving a fact about himself that costs him. She took her coffee and her composure, and she left. And in the corridor she stood for a moment, with her hand against the wall, and she let her breath out slowly, all of it, the whole collected weight of a night and a morning, and then she straightened, because there was work to do, and Nadia Vasquez did not leave work undone. Sal found her in the administrative office at 11 and told her Domenico had called a meeting of the estate's senior team for noon. She said, "What kind of meeting?" He said, "The kind where he announces things." She filed that and kept working. The noon meeting convened in the estate's formal conference room, which Nadia had last used for an event planning session and which still smelled faintly of the jasmine arrangement she had placed on the table then and removed the week prior. Domenico sat at the head of the table. His attorney was present, and Sal and the estate's head of finance, a man named Bertrand, who had held the role for 20 years and whose relationship with Nadia was the collegial respect of two people who handle a great deal of money carefully and have never stolen any of it. Domenico opened by stating, without preamble, that the planned wedding event was canceled and the financial exposure from the vendor double billing was in resolution. He stated that going forward, all vendor contracts and external event partnerships would require dual authorization from the estate's management team. He paused and looked at Nadia and said, "I am asking Nadia Vasquez to assume co-authorization authority on all estate expenditures above $50,000, effective immediately." Bertrand's pen stopped moving. Sal's expression did not change, but the still quality of his stillness shifted in a way Nadia recognized as his version of satisfaction. Domenico said, "There will be a formal title revision to reflect the role. She has been functioning in this capacity in practice for some time. This makes it formal." He looked at Nadia again, that same full-weight look, and she held it this time without looking at the wall, and she said, "I accept." Bertrand said, "I should note, for the record, that this is overdue." Domenico said, "Yes." He said it with a flat clarity that admitted everything the word contained. The meeting concluded in 22 minutes. As people filed out, Sal passed Nadia and said under his breath, in his economical way, "Took him long enough." She said, 7 years. He said he'll spend the next 7 making it right. She said, "That remains to be seen." He said, "It won't," and walked out. The afternoon moved in its practical grooves. Vendor calls, a revised catering consult, 24 notifications sent through the appropriate channels, a conference with the florist in the village, who received the news with the particular philosophical equanimity of someone who has supplied flowers to powerful households long enough to understand that events are canceled and deposits are honored, and she made sure the deposit was honored before she ended the call. She worked until 6, and then she changed out of her professional attire in the staff room, and she was putting on her coat when Domenico appeared in the doorway. She said, "I was going to review the secondary vendor list tonight." He said, "That will wait." She looked at him. He said, "I would like you to have dinner with me, not as staff." He said it simply, not as an invitation that expected to be refused, but not as a command either. As something he had decided to ask and was asking. She said, "That is a significant change in the terms of employment." He said, "It is." "I am aware of what I am asking." She said, "Are you?" He said, "I am asking you to let me see you. The way I should have?" He said, "I understand if the answer is no. I understand if 7 years of being walked past by me earns me no." She put her coat on, slowly. She buttoned it. She thought about 11 minutes in the rain and 7 years of crystal counted in empty rooms and the way a second coffee cup could sit in a sternum like a bell struck softly and still ringing. She said, "One dinner. We see how you do." Something crossed his face, swift and unguarded, something she did not have a name for yet but thought she might name given time. He said, "I will not waste it." She said, "No, you won't." They ate in the small dining room, not the grand hall, at a table set for two with none of the formal architecture of an estate dinner. And he poured the wine himself because there was no one else to pour it, and that was not an accident. And they talked. Not about vendors or authorization levels or the quiet wreckage of a canceled wedding. They talked the way two people talk when they are finally in the same room after having occupied the same building for 7 years from two different distances. She told him about her grandmother's kitchen in Valencia, where she had learned to make the bread she sometimes made for the estate's Sunday table, and that he had eaten for 7 years without knowing who had made it. He sat very still when she said that, the arrested, breathing stillness, and he said, "The bread on Sundays." And she said, "Yes," and he said, "I thought that was bakery bread," and she said, "No." And the weight of that small revelation appeared to cost him something he was willing to pay. He told her about his father's photograph that he kept in his jacket pocket, and he said it without preamble, the way you say something to someone you already know has seen it. And she said, "I know." And he looked at her and said, "Of course you do." They stayed at that table for 3 hours. Outside, the evening settled into its cold quiet, and the rose beds were dark shapes below the windows, and the estate made its old wood sounds around them, the sound of a house that had been managed with care for 7 years and had the structural integrity to prove it. When she stood to leave, he stood too, and he said, "Nadia." She said, "Yes." He said, "I am not going to walk past you again." She looked at him for a long moment, that straight look she had decided in the morning not to spare. She said, "I know you mean that." He said, "But," she said, "but meaning something and doing something are two different kinds of work. You'll need to do the second kind." He said, "I understand." She said, "We'll see." She meant it as a challenge, and he received it as one, and she thought that was probably the correct start. She walked home to the small cottage at the edge of the estate grounds that she had occupied for 4 of her 7 years there, which she had furnished herself with things that were not glamorous and not expensive and were entirely hers. The wool blanket from Seville, the ceramic lamp she had found at a market in the city, the bookshelf that occupied an entire wall and that no one who came to the estate's main house had ever seen. She made tea, and she sat at her table, and she looked at the window where the estate's lights were visible through the dark tree line, and she thought carefully and without sentiment about what had happened in the span of one night and one morning and one afternoon. A door had been locked against her. She had found another way in. She had always found another way in, because that was who she was, because locked doors were not arguments she intended to lose. She had brought what she carried, all 3 days of it, the weight of documented fact, and she had set it on a man's desk in the morning light and let it speak. And the world had shifted on its axis, not because she had waited for someone to notice her, but because she had kept the accounts, literally and otherwise, with the patience of someone who knows that the ledger always balances in the end. She was not yet sure what came next between her and Domenico Caruso. She was sure of this. She would not be walked past again, not because he had promised it, because she had decided it for herself in the rain, standing outside a bolted door in the dark when she had felt the full weight of being invisible to the person who most needed to see clearly. She had counted to 10. Then she had found the key. In the morning, she was at her desk at 6:45, as always, but the papers on the desk were different. Her name was on the authorization line. The title below it was new. And at 7 o'clock, Domenico's coffee appeared on the corner of her desk beside her own, carried by no one, because she heard his footsteps in the corridor and recognized their particular quality, steady and deliberate, no longer passing by. He knocked at the open door, which he had not done before, and she looked up. And he said, "Good morning." She said, "Good morning." He said, "The bread on the Sunday table?" She said, "Yes." He said, "I would like to know how it is made." She looked at him for a moment with the clear, appraising patience of a woman who has spent 7 years watching and has just been given reason to begin being watched in return. She said, "That will take time." He said, "I have time." She said, "Then sit down." He sat. She looked at the door he had knocked on, then at the man on the other side of her desk who was looking at her the way a person looks at something they have decided not to waste another moment not seeing properly, and she thought of her grandmother's kitchen and the weight of bread dough under her hands, the way something simple made with attention becomes, over time, the thing a person cannot imagine the world without. She thought of what it meant to be truly seen by someone who had the authority to look everywhere and had chosen, finally, to look here. She picked up her pen. She said, "Let us begin."